ecologist at Harvard Forest out in Pederson, Massachusetts. Neil did his undergraduate research at SUNY ESF out in Syracuse, working on ecosystems and forest biology, and that has been a theme throughout his career. He also obtained a Master of Science degree in forest ecology from Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama, and then went on to do a PhD in forest ecology and climate change at Columbia University in the Department of Earth and Environment Sciences in New York. Since that time, he's worked as a professor as well as a full-time researcher, senior ecologist at Harvard Forest. A lot of his research focuses on sort of the interface of forest ecology, climate dynamics, using tools from dendrochronology, dendroecology to understand long-term forest dynamics and sort of forest ecology. He has an incredible record of publications in that field, dozens and dozens of really interesting papers, lead author, co-authored papers. And so we're really excited to have him down today to sort of share some insights from all that work he's done in the fields of sort of dendroecology, dendroclimatology, all these various things. The title for today's talk is Trees Don't Read Textbooks and Other Woody Stories of Persistence, Individuality, and Resilience. So thank you very much for coming out. Looking forward to hearing your talk.
So thank you. It's really an honor to be here at 1,000 meetings. That's really impressive. So what I'm going to do today, as you can see by the talk, I forgot to put my name and my institution on and everything like that, because it's a new year, it's a new decade, and for whatever reason, when I started writing the abstract and the title for this, I said I'm going to do something new, because I realized I've been saying a lot of the same things for the last 5 or 6 years, and in ways I'm going to say the same thing, but it's going to sound different this time. So I'm going to pause at some points, because I'm going to be trying to remember what I was really trying to say. So I'm not totally experimenting on you, because if I did, I would bring a waiver form, but I didn't want to go that far. I am going to show you lots of data today, because I really believe in data, and I like data, and I know people can handle data. And so before we get into that, though, I need to thank and honor all the thousands of trees that I've gained information from that have helped inform me over time. The many people who have helped me in the lab, in the field. I had over 100 volunteers during my dissertation, so I was really grateful for that, and I am grateful for that. And then the sponsors and the institutions that helped me collect this information and digest this information. And a little announcement that I'm working on a textbook called The Memory of Trees. It's Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you very much. And so what I'm doing as a part of this is, if it's okay, I can record my talk for myself. Some of this is going to end up in the book, and I'm going to record it and get it transcribed, and so I'm writing the book as we talk. Don't ask me when it's coming out. I'm not sure. And as I reviewed my abstract for today, after I had finished putting together my talk, I realized there were 2 big things that I was going to talk about that I didn't put into the talk. And I usually do think and talk about things at very large scales and deeper time periods, and we'll get to some of that, but I've gotten really fascinated by individual tree growth lately. I've been going down scale a little bit, and I'm actually at heart I'm a natural historian, really, and so I figured this is a friendly room where I can go there and it would be okay, and that you actually might like it. So the 2 things I was going to tell you that I'm not going to spend much time on is it's getting wetter in this part of the world. We talked a little bit about this in a paper in 2013. A new paper came out this week that confirms that we're in a 500-year wetting trend in the summer. This is one of the wettest periods in the last 500 years or so. We've not really had a significant drought. 2016 was bad, but it was really only 1.5 years or 2 years. Southern Connecticut, it was a 5-year drought, and it was semi-significant. But in the long-term perspective, we really haven't had a serious drought. And the other thing I wanted to tell you is, and this is going to shock you, when it doesn't rain much, trees are more likely to die. And so our forests, I would argue right now, are fairly stable outside of what we do to it in invasive species. Climatically speaking, I would say it's very stable in ways. But in the past, we have evidence of forests changing abruptly-ish at large scales, which goes against what I learned as an undergraduate. And so those are those 2 points, and now let's talk about trees. And trees don't read textbooks. This is something I came up with, and I put it on Twitter about 5 or 6 months ago. And the idea is that trees are not illiterate. They understand things very well. But what I really want to say is, you know the civics manuals of North America. Do you know Volume 1, Volume 2? Volume 2 is the best because hardwoods are way better. They got real flowers. But I love this book. When I finally started realizing, discovering trees, just trying to teach myself about trees and try to understand them better, I love this book. It's chock full of great information. There's a lot of good information in them. But in the last 2 decades, as I've started coring more and more species in different trees, I realized that there's a lot of information in there that's it's not on point. It's not correct. So that's the major theme they're going to be coming back over and over again. And what I usually do when I give a general talk, general public talk, I stop for a minute and I get people to meditate on trees, because most people are more familiar with pandas and whales and things like that. And I don't think I have to describe to you how trees are different than whales and pandas and things like that. But I do want to dwell on trees for a second to think about their lives a little bit more to help set up this talk. And so, does anyone want to guess where this might be?
Labrador.
Does this help? Okay. This is Mongolia. And I've been very fortunate to have been there 9 times and done research in their forests. They have wonderful forests. And I wanted to put up some pictures of some of the first people I met on my very first trip in Western Mongolia. And it was my first time out of the country, really. And I went all the way to Western Mongolia. And the amazing thing is you see this very different culture with very different foods and everything. And you get to know them and you're like, oh, you remind me of Vermonters. You know, like, withdrawn at first, they're unsure about who you are, but if you can break through that, they'll do anything for you. And the Mongolians are just like that, just really wonderful people. So, I've been to Mongolia a few times, doing lots of research. The last few times we've been studying trees on lava fields. There's our campsite right there. A really amazing landscape. It's really dynamic. You know, I wrestled for 10 years, and I'm really glad I did, because when you get off of one of these lava fields in the middle of the summer in the heat in Mongolia, you're just beat up. It's physically very hard work. I'm not complaining. It looks really glorious, and sure it is, but I'm telling you, it's really hard work, but it's just wonderful work too. And these are just some of the scenes. I'm just going to show you some gratuitous pictures for a little while. These are just some of the scenes. This is the lava field looking back at our campsite. We're not on the high ridge, we're at a lower ridge behind that. And in getting ready for this, I saw this photograph. I don't remember looking at it since I took the picture of it, but when I saw it again, I said, oh yeah, this is the place we were at. This is the second lava field we were working at, and this is the scene where we heard and we saw wolves the first time we drove up to it. So, really amazing landscape. It should be a national park. I mean, if it was in Colorado, everyone would be there. But I show you this introduction because when trees are used to inspire the general public, it's often trees kind of like this. They're really battered and tattered and worn out trees because they're trying to say, look, your life is hard, that's right, but be inspired by this tree. Look at it, it's still persisting, it's still doing that. And this is a good example. This is a baby Siberian pine, Pinus sibirica, and it's got strip bark pine. This is all dead wood here, and the live wood is on the back side of this picture. There's a few needles on it, but baby strip bark pines turn into adult pine trees, and here's what it could look like in 500 years. This tree is dead though, so you know, this tree is dead, but I love this picture because it shows you the really modular and plastic ways of life of being a tree, right? So they have to sit there and take it for centuries and centuries, and when you're sitting on a hot, dry lava field in a cold, dry part of the world, you just live and you survive and you persist as much as you can. And you can see the layers of this tree like dying back, growing, and You remember the stories, or maybe some of you maybe saw some of this, when they used to cut the sides out of cows to look at the stomachs, to look at things digest. And one day we were on the lava field and we found a log that looked like this, and we spent 2 hours cutting it open just trying to figure out what the heck is going on in this tree. And it's amazingly complex. And here's another side view of this tree. I mean, it's a tree, but there's a tree we think about in the background. That's a Siberian larch in the background, the straight tree like that. And that's what we have in our mind in our trees. But in this lava field, we have trees like this, and really tenacious, really persistent. And it just is really eye-opening to think about this is how some trees in the world live. Now when you come back to our part of the world, we know that trees struggle in ways, but we don't see that outward expression in the same way. We don't know about the struggles of their lives over centuries until we core them, open them up, and really understand what they've been through. You can kind of infer some of it from the structure of the tree. So this is a black oak behind in a green space near our house. It goes up for about 30 feet. It goes over for about 20 or 30 feet maybe, and then it starts to go up. You can see its top. And it's got a branch. It's finally starting to access getting into the canopy. It's finally directly maybe starting to get some sunlight. That's a tortured life. And you can guess that by looking at its shape. But not all trees look like that, and I don't know how that tree is still standing, but it is, and I don't know how long it'll stay standing, but my guess is it'll stay standing for quite a while. Trees are amazing, but I don't have to tell you that. But after all this time of studying trees over time and getting to understand their inner lives, I wish I had an art history class in college or knew anything about art, and I don't. But the first time I saw this picture, I said, oh, this is it. This is the painting about the inner lives of trees. You know, with the dynamics that you see here, the cycles that you see here, looks like cross sections over there on the side. And I'm so focused on trees and things like that that it took me a couple years of showing this in talks to realize that there are people in the picture. So that's where I am. But I think this is a really nice expression of how I think about trees and what I've learned about them in the last 20 years. What you're looking at here are the inner lives of trees, or the memories of trees. And these are 12 core samples from different species in Bhutan. This is a core, this is a core, this is a core. These are the core mounts in between them. And there's 12 different species here, including, this is a semi-evergreen oak that is either 200 years old or 600 years old. I can't really tell because the rings are so hard to see. But what you're looking at here is information, right? And you're looking at the lives of trees, and these cross lines here say something about how they grew each year. And you'll notice that there's a lot of individuality here. Here's some wide rings here, here's some narrow rings and a wide ring, and narrow rings and wider rings. And so each tree and each species has its own life. And there is just so much information that you can see right now with your eyes, with the color of the wood, the density of the wood, the spacing of the rings, and then inside the wood, the things you can't see, like the isotopes that are locked up in the wood. And we can tell a lot of information about the history and the environment around these trees by dissecting and taking this information apart and breaking it down. So our science now is really technically over 100 years, I'd say. Early 1910s, 1920s, when we became formalized as a science. Da Vinci and Pliny the Elder, and they understood tree rings pretty well, I'm sure. But it became formalized in the early 1900s. And since that time, when tree ring scientists give talks, they say, oh, tree rings are scribes, they record history, and tree rings are recorders, and they record history. And David Borden Buckley came to the Harvard Forest as a Bullard Fellow, as an artist in residence, and he went around and interviewed all the scientists there, and he sat down with me, and I was telling him this, oh, recorders and scribes and things like that, and he goes, oh, like a thumb drive, like a USB, and I was like, yeah, man, that's perfect, because I was like, it's time for an update, and he created that dendro data stick that, you know, I don't think of trees as only a dendro data stick, but they are important sources of information. And then I also got tired of the scribes and recorders and things like that. So I started Googling around for the word chronologist. And I found this quote. I've never checked to see if it's real. It might be fake, but I don't care because it is so apt to what we do. That learn noise and dust of the chronologist is wholly to be avoided. And I love that because if you break that phrase in two, that learn noise and dust, that's the struggle of the life of trees and plants too. And you know, the struggling that they sit there in one place and the world swirls around them and changes constantly. That's a dusty, noisy life, I would think. And then the chronologist is wholly to be avoided. More and more, that when we use trees to learn about the world, they surprise us, they prove us wrong, and even when we like go to old buildings here in Boston or all over and try to date when the timbers are cut, it turns out often that the houses are much younger than they're advertised. And the owners don't like to know that because it devalues the house a little bit, but you're like, well, this is the truth, and if you don't want to know the truth, you better avoid the chronologist. And so this is me in the field. This is from the snowy day, and it's, you know, the most checked out book in New York City Public Library history in the last 100 years or something like that. And I have 2 young kids, and I started reading this book to them. It's just a wonderful book. But as soon as I saw this for the first time as an adult, I said, oh yeah, that's what I do. I stand there and I ponder trees, and I go out with my increment board, and I forgot to bring in the increment board today. I'm really sorry about that. But what do we do besides staring at trees? And I'm sure you know this part. We go out with an increment bore, we go and we drill into the tree, and we take out a sample that's about the diameter of a chopstick, is probably the best analogy. And that's where we get our information. We don't cut down live trees, we just extract information from just this little sliver of wood. People are concerned whether we're hurting the trees, and I try to remind them of maple season and lightning and ice storms. But still, we've gone back as a group, and we've studied the mortality rates of trees that have been cored in the past, and there's no differences in mortality rates between living trees and of trees that were cored and trees that were not cored. So it's non-destructive sampling. We take 1 sample, 2 samples, sometimes 3 per tree, and it probably never gets cored again. Unfortunately, there are some really old trees that a lot of dendrochronologists like to go back and core. So there are some trees that have been cored 13 times over their lifetime, maybe more. And one of them I cored. And it was for teaching, and that tree was growing as fast as it ever had in its entire life, even when we cored it at 400 years of age. So we don't have much evidence that we're hurting the trees. And I'm not going to burden you too much with methods. I'm going to talk about what we've learned, but one important thing I want to talk about is a thing called cross-dating. And it's basically finding the patterns of large and small rings through time within a tree, between trees, to build a record where, if we do this correctly, we can put calendar dates on each and every ring. We can say, if this event happens in 1901, we can say, it happened in 1901 plus or minus 0. Right? Radiocarbon dating, which is getting better and better all the time, is plus or minus 50, plus or minus 20. We can say exactly it happened in this year. What's really fun and cool about this, it's only fun for some people, but I think it's fun, is we can take cores from living trees, and then we can take samples from dead trees, and we can match the ring patterns, and we can go farther back in time. And then we can go, like I inferred just a second ago, we can go to places like Independence Hall, old buildings, and we can take samples from their beams, match them up to this living record, and go farther back in time. So there's a record of oak growth in the Boston area that dates to at least the 1490s, but I actually think it's the 1390s, because there are some timbers in this town that are old enough that we've accessed that go back all the way. So we have, 600 years of oak growth in this region from old houses and living trees. And it's very precise. How precise is it? I told you, but let me show you. This is a sample of tulip poplar from Central Virginia in the mountains. There's a pencil mark right there. That's 1770. 1, 2, 3. This narrow ring is 1774. Okay? Very, very narrow ring. In this sample, this circle that I draw right here, you don't see a narrow ring. On this side of this tree, there is no ring formed in 1774. When things are so stressed for that individual tree, sometimes they don't fully form a ring on one side or maybe even all around the side of the tree. So this is why we cross-date. You can't count rings. When I see newspaper accounts telling us how we count rings, and I said, no, we don't count rings because there are mistakes made when you count. But when you cross that, you get it right. Here's another one right here. You can see it's very fuzzy right here. There's like one cell there. There's one cell there. We call those micro rings for the obvious reason. That's 1774. And here's the ring, the sample that really helped me understand what was happening in this year. Right here, this is 1774. And you see the wood was broken, and wood often breaks in rings. It sounds obvious, where it's really weak. But we know when certain events happen that, like a volcanic eruption that reduces the growing season in the northern trees, the wood breaks on those rings quite often. So the wood broke on this ring, and that ring is a little whitish in color. And we know from experiments that when trees get defoliated, the wood that gets formed has less lignin and it looks white. So when I saw this, I said, oh, it's a defoliation. And so I started presenting this in scientific talks and everything, and I said, oh, it's probably a defoliation, like a frost event. There was always one person in the back of the room who said, it's an insect. And I said, okay, well, tell me what insect defoliates across genera in 1774. So here's that tulip poplar sample. Here's 1774 in a chestnut oak. Here's 1774 in a white ash. We found it in hickory. It shows up in American chestnut. It shows up in lots of species. And I said, which one? And they said, oh, insects get really bad. I said, in 1774? So it pushed me to like go ask someone, where can I find this information? So I contacted Kerry Mock. He's a climate historian at the University of South Carolina. He goes into old records, written records, ship's logs, and he reconstructs climate history. And his specialty is frost-killing events. I said, Kerry, where can I learn about a possible frost in the southern Appalachians in 1774? And he goes, he's amazing. He goes, oh, the Moravians. And you go to this volume and this book and maybe this. So I checked out the book, Interlibrary Loan. I'm walking home, I'm opening the book, and I almost walk into the intersection because it says so-and-so was born, so-and-so died, so-and-so got married. Oh, and it was the worst frost we can remember. And in fact, they said spring came 2 weeks earlier than normal that year. And then the evenings of May 4th, May 5th, 1774, was the hardest frost that anyone remembers. They had been living there since the 1750s. Fruit of every kind is killed, the acorns and all the other nuts in the forest. It looked worse than winter. And this is in May. And there's actually 2 villages that said that they were stalked by panthers. And my ecological interpretation of this is the small mammals went into the villages to get food, and the panthers followed them. So really cool event. And this is Kerry Mock, and he had never heard of this event before. It was in the trees. And I said, Kerry, where is this? And he told me, and it was there. And since then, he's found it all over the southeastern United States. Jefferson wrote about it. George Washington wrote about it. Farmers in Georgia, South Carolina wrote about it. It's really, really there. So this is how precise we are. That ring shows up precisely in 1774, and it's a 2-day event that interrupted its growing season that severely. Since then, we've been able to confirm that we cross date perfectly back to the 700s using cosmic rays and elevated carbon and cool stuff like that. It works. So let's, the trees that can drop knowledge on us, let's talk about what we know about trees or what they are teaching us about life. Trees don't read textbooks. So this is my lab from a couple years ago. It was a very international lab. I had a lot of visiting scientists from China and Spain and Turkey and Indiana, which is not very foreign, but you know, it's a good joke. Ross is great, anyways. And so we were really happy because this tree right here is the oldest documented chestnut oak. In a year or two, it'll be 450 years old. If I asked you how well do you think a 450-year-old tree is growing, what would you say?
Not well.
Not well, thank you. So here's a picture of the core when I collected it in 2002. This is the width of the rings that between 1900 and 2002. The bark is on the far right side. Here it is between 1800 and 1899. Here it is between 1700 and 1799. And here it is between 1576 and 1699. Yep, this is one of the first lessons I learned during my dissertation, where I was like, oh wow, I didn't know that. It's like, I like to describe it as if your grandparent could start dunking a basketball. Like my dad, who's going to be 83 this month, suddenly he starts dunking a basketball, and he's only like this tall, and that'd be amazing. But trees are not people. Trees are kind of like people, but trees are not people. And over and over and over, we're seeing this. And this is what the ringlets look like. And so I want to walk you through this slide, because I'm going to be showing you lots of data slides like this. This is ring width in millimeters here. This is time. And this is the annual ring width of this tree through time. And you can see the largest rings are being formed when it's 400 years old, 430 years old. All right? Grandparents can dunk. But that's just one tree and one species. That doesn't prove anything. Okay? Let's talk about tulip poplar, one of the best trees, certainly in the East, one of the best ones. It's a great tree. And so this is a collection of tree data from the southern Appalachians, from the Smokies and North Georgia. This is what we call a spaghetti plot. You see the whole mess of ring widths. Millimeters here through time. These are the individual trees, and the orange line is the mean. And what you see here is, after this period, growth ring widths are constant, relatively constant through time. I mean, the average is relatively constant. And this is really important, and let me show you why. It all comes down to geometry, essentially. I was not very good at geometry, but I've learned now. This is ring widths from a pine tree in Mongolia, and this is what we typically expect when we collect from trees that are grown in open conditions. Like a tree, if we cord one of these trees out here in the green, this is what the ring widths would generally look like. They're wider at the beginning, and then they decline and sort of settle down through time. This is called a negative exponential growth pattern, and this is what we expect. And we expect this because even if a tree is growing at a constant rate, the stem always expands. So at a constant rate, to put that wood around an expanding stem requires the rings to get thinner and thinner so it can cover the whole tree. So just geometry, and there's other things, but it's a lot of geometry, is forcing ring widths to decline over time. So when you see flat average ring widths on a tree going out 400 or 500 years, that doesn't mean it's growing at a constant rate. You've got to correct for that. There's a lot of ways we can correct for that. The simplest way is to put it into pi r squared and create circles, essentially, of these. And so now let's take that population of tulip poplar in the southern Appalachians, and let's fix that. Let's turn it into actual growth. And this is what it looks like. All right, so there's multiple trees in here over a larger region. The orange line is the average of that population. The blue lines are the 95% confidence limits. Most of the rings fall within there. And what you can see is the greatest growth is happening when these trees are 200, 300, and 400 years old. All right, so cool. We got two species that can dunk on you. Let's go look at some other trees. This is Huon pine, Huon pine. Oh, genus is escaping my brain right now. Sorry. This is in Mount Reed in Tasmania. A colleague down there sent me some of her data to use in, and I'll just step right to the basal area increment curve. This is actual growth. These trees, I only kept the ones that were 400 years and older. So there's a bunch of different trees in here, but they're all at least 4 centuries or older. The oldest one is almost 1,100 years. Largest rings in the last decade or two. And this is really important because the Mount Reed Huon pine are limited by temperature. Their growth is limited by temperature. And so what you're seeing out there is global warming. In the southern hemisphere, global warming shows up in the instrumental records and in the tree rings much later than it does in the northern hemisphere because the ocean is absorbing so much more heat that the warming has been delayed in the southern hemisphere. So this real hockey stick at the end, this uptick in the end, is when global warming overwhelms the capacity of the ocean to absorb heat. I mean, it's still absorbing heat, but now it's showing up in the instrumental records and in the trees. So that uptick is global warming, but it also says age doesn't matter to trees. So I just want to show you more and more of this. This is a Lursae. Fitzroya is the genus. It's the redwood of South America. I think you know where I'm going with this. It can live 3,600 years. These are the oldest trees from 3 populations in Argentina that a colleague sent me. The oldest trees are, well over 1,000 years. The largest rings are when they're the oldest. Age doesn't matter to trees. Bristlecone pine, I wish I could take credit for this image. This was the New Yorker article that came out last week on bristlecone pine, a really nice article. Months ago, I contacted one of the people they interviewed for that, and I said, hey, Matt, can you send me some of your data? I want to just create some tree ring records. And he said, sure, and as you know, this is the oldest documented living tree in the world that we know of, probably 5,000 years, probably older. And this is what it looks like. And so these are the trees that are 800 to 1,000 to 2,000 years old. I'm not showing you the whole record, because I think they should be convinced by now. Age doesn't matter to trees. Trees can dunk when they're ancient. And this is a global warming signal again with these trees on the top of the mountain. Record mostly temperature, though that is starting to change. So, trees don't read textbooks, part 1. Age doesn't matter. Old trees can dunk. Part 2 is about what we understand about trees. And in part, what we understand about trees. Our community, the tree ring community, has been sharing data in a publicly accessible data bank for 40 years now, since the 70s. It won't be 50 years soon. And this is the distribution of tree ring records, more than 4,000 records around the world. The hot spots are in Western North America, of course, because that's where tree rings was formalized. There's a good lab in Switzerland, and so the distribution of records really reflects the wealth of nations and the science that's happening, and this is a very classic pattern in almost any field biology. What I'm not going to show you, but you have to believe me, I'll tell you, when we did an ecological analysis of this data set, we found that 80% of the records are conifers. Only 19% are broadleaf species, 67% of that are oaks, 25% of that are beech. So what do we know about these species? Virtually nothing, I would say. This is sourwood, this is yellow buckeye, and that's silverbell, halesia. They change the species name all the time, and I can't keep up anymore. Mountain silverbell is a wonderful species. And what I want to tell you is we don't even know how long these trees live. So let me give you some examples. We're coming back to tulip poplar. This is in the Smoky Mountains. We were teaching students dendrochronology at a field week. There I am. That's a pretty big tree. We took a picture of it because it's a pretty big tree. And then after we finished coring it, it was lunchtime and the students wanted to take a lunch. And I said, yeah, sure, go have lunch. And me and Jess Riddle, we're going to go core that other tree over there. And I don't have a picture of that tree because it was only 1 meter in diameter. It was only this big. And so we got it back to the lab, though, and it's a remarkable tree because it turns out that it was over 500 years old and it was hollow. There's a picture of the tree right there. It's not a terribly huge tree compared to that other one. The remarkable thing to me is when I was a master's student and starting my PhD, we thought tulip poplar or liriodendron lived 330, 350 years. There was some rumors of a 400-year-old tree, but that's rumors. This is 500 years and it's hollow. So I estimate that this species can probably live 600, 650, and really 700 would not surprise me. And so I call this tree like the Doug fir of the East. It's disturbance species, it's fast growing, it's the tallest documented one, produces a lot of wood. It's better because it has real flowers. And it can live 700 years. Well, let's just say 600 for now, but I wouldn't be surprised someday that maybe we'll get a 600 to 700-year-old tree. But that's not the only thing we found like that. This is Mel Padawani. She was a summer student of ours a couple summers ago. This is in the Adirondacks in an old-growth forest. This is white ash, Fraxinus americana. Inner pith date, which we didn't get pith date, but the inner ring that we got is 1711. It's 304 years. I saw it last year, so now it's about 2 years older. There's no maximum age for this species in the Silvix manual. No maximum age. And the other thing I'll tell you that won't surprise you now, it grew slower when it was smaller, and now it's accelerating in growth the last 150 years. So forget what you know about white ash and how it can grow, because it doesn't matter, it grows. Yellow birch, it's an important species. It's probably been studied a lot. There are rumors that it can live 400 or 500 years, and I believe those rumors. It's never been cored well enough properly. It's difficult to work with in terms of seeing its rings. This is a hollow one. It's 343 years old, so who knows how long it lives. And this is in the Adirondacks again. Nyssa sylvatica, black gum, black tupelo, pepper ridge, whatever you want to call it. This is the oldest documented broadleaf species in North America. In a field week in the 90s, they found one that had fallen over. They took a cross-section over of it, and it was 679 years old. When we all learned about that, we all went and cored Nyssa, and then we said, oh God, this is hard to work with, I'm done with Nyssa. That's what I said anyways. But we cored it here outside the Adirondacks, this population with David Frank, and the oldest trees dated to the 1400s. The oldest one dated to 1427. It's just all over the place. It's never been a valuable species for timber, so these are old trees. Very slow growing, very old trees. And no one really knew this until about 2 decades ago, a little less than that. Yellow buckeye, really, really one of my favorite trees. This is in the Smokies again, just incredible bark, nice flowers. I can't say for sure, but my lab was one of the first labs to core this species because I was just fascinated by it. I'm like, let's go core it. And my master student found one that was 400 years old, and we finally started working up samples from this forest. And I don't know for sure, but I think it can live 500 years. We definitely have it 420, 430, 450 years. I'm sure it can live 500. And we just don't know anything about it. You know, these are some of the first samples that we've got from the species. Straight maple. I'm just throwing this up because it's fun. This tree right here is 51 years old. It's only this big. The oldest one in that stand we got is 67 years, 66 years old. Can it live 100 years? Why not? Because we don't know. But I'm telling you these ages because I can say the same thing about cucumber magnolia. In the Silvex manual it says seldom lives more than 150 years. There's one that was been found that's 430 years old, 20 feet up the stem. Trees don't read textbooks. Textbooks are wrong. Job. I really like Job. And it's mostly because during my dissertation we bowled every week, and when we would miss a spare, we were like, oh, you got Job, man. You really got screwed. But Job is a really nice symbol of persistence, and definitely if Job lived that life, that was a hard life. But let's talk about trees and persistence. This is, you know this one, Petrolenta, black birch. What do you know about birches?
They have
Short-lived.
sap.
Hmm?
They have sap you can drink.
They have sap you can drink, that's for sure. I think I heard short-lived, fast-growing, early successional after disturbance. That's all the things I learned too. Let me tell you about tree 68, 33 centimeters diameter, so about this big. It was, again, this one was hollow. These are its inner rings. This is the early 1800s. There's about 50 rings staring at you right there. This won't surprise you anymore. This is towards the end. This is marked as 2000. It's not. This was a ring count, so it was off by 10 years. This is in about the mid-90s. There's 30 rings here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4.5 rings there. The same size as these 30 rings. So what does that tell you? It tells me that this tree was suppressed. When we sampled this tree, it was in an intermediate canopy position. So I had like that black oak I showed you. One branch was sticking into the canopy, but the rest of this tree was in the understory. It's suppressed, but it's a pioneer species that's shade intolerant, that's fast living and short-lived, right? Wrong, 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 wrong. We know this species can live at least 360 years. We found several that are 300. We found many that are over 200. This individual was growing 0.5 millimeters for 200 years in the understory. And we don't have the center of this tree. So is it another 100 years older? Maybe. Wouldn't be surprised. But it doesn't fit any of the things that you immediately think about in terms of a birch. This is Dano Holtz, Dano, she likes to go by Dano. She's just fabulous. An English major who learned about trees is now going to be a PhD, and she's going to be a good one too. She was a summer student this past summer, and I said, you know, Dano, you know what species we haven't studied enough is hickory. Let's go study shagbark hickory. And she said, I'm game, and she was game. And at the Harvard Forest, even though a lot of the forest is red oak, red maple, white pine, and it's really interesting. We have these little pockets where it feels like you're standing on top of a mountain in Virginia in some ways, and this is one of them. I've called it Hickory Hill, but I always expect pterodactyls and woolly mammoths to pop out from behind this. It's an amazing cluster of the shaggiest shagbarks I've really ever seen. So there's one paper about the dynamics of shagbark hickory that we know of. Dano found it, and the author, who's forestry based, said, well, if it doesn't get into the canopy in 30 years, it's dead. It's not going to make it. You know where this is going. Wrong. It's just wrong. And so here's the first tree that she cored, number 9. Here's ringlets in millimeters, and it probably started in a gap. And hickory is not very fast growing, especially near the northern end of its range. And by about 1930, it was in the understory. We think it's in the understory. It's in the understory today. And so for at least 80 years, this tree has been sitting in the understory. It's only about this big. It dates to the 1890s. It's almost 130 years old. It's this big. That's it. And it's not the only one we found there like it. We found a red oak very, very similar. So even in the modern science literature about how shagbark hickory grows, it's just wrong. It's just wrong. This is one of my favorite trees that we've encountered. This is Todd Clark Ridge out in Mohawk Trail State Forest. There's an old growth forest out there. There's a church in Vienna that has these swirly pillars, and that's what this tree reminds me of. So white oak, intermediate shade intolerant is what they call it. And so this is Junzhou Zhang. He's a PhD student who spent a year with me. Really fabulous guy. And you can see, here's the profile of that tree. It's just a snake climbing a tree trying to get into the canopy. It has 1 or 2 branches marginally getting into the canopy. It dates the 1780s. It's 240 years old, and it's been in the understory its entire life. Maybe it got a glimpse of sun from a gap for about 20 years, but it couldn't take advantage of it. I estimate there's only 28 rings that are above ½ millimeter in 240 years. It's alive. From a forestry perspective, it would be a loser, and we should cut it because it's not going to give you straight timber and all this stuff, but ecologically and evolutionarily, it's alive, and that's a winner. And when all the other trees fall down, it can still live and throw out acorns and continue its life and continue its progeny. So this is the part of ecology that I really, really enjoy, because this makes you realize we shouldn't underestimate trees. So let's come back to tulip poplar again. I guess I really do like tulip poplar. Tulip poplar is a disturbance species, right? It comes up in gaps, very, very shade intolerant, right? So this is a student, Adrienne Cooper, a master's student of mine in Kentucky. She named it Sunshine. She'd say, hello, Sunshine, and this is in Angel Hollow in Kentucky. And, you know, our characteristics of tulip poplar is it's a straight tree, except for when it's not. And so you can see this tree doing that snaking up into the canopy, and this is the life of that tree. Again, it's hollow. We don't know exactly how old it is. It's over 200 years old, and look at this growth right here. Maybe it was so severely damaged that it didn't recover for 80 years, but I'm going to suggest by this release, right here, this release from competition, that it was suppressed for 80 to 100 years, that it was maybe overtopped by an American chestnut, or overtopped by a red oak, or who knows what. But this defies what we think about in terms of tulip poplar. Now these are only individual trees, and they may be the exceptions, but the exceptions might make the rule in long-term ecology and evolution. And so this is what we're learning. And so I'm going to go a little gratuitous one more time. This is a tree that I ran into in the northeast corner of Tibetan Plateau 2 summers ago, and My wife's here, and she knows this. I want to cohabitate with this tree. It's just, I saw this tree, and we just kept driving by it, and I said, can we stop? Can we stop? Can we stop? And eventually, after breakfast, I said, you know, I need to go walk down the road, and I just walked down the road, and I took an hour taking pictures of this tree. This is Betula abelsinensis, the Chinese red birch. Can you imagine if our paper birch was red? Because that's what it looks like. And in the morning light in a dark forest, these flecks of bark catch the sun. This isn't a good picture. It was just so much better with my eyes. I just wanted to show you that, but I also wanted to show you that because I said to them, hey, how old is this tree? How long does it live? And they're like, we don't know. We've never recorded. I'm like, what do you, how could you not want to find out more about this amazing tree? And it's in the Tibetan Plateau. It's dry, it's cold. It's a birch. I know they're short-lived, but they're not. And so I'm going to tell you. And so I said, they said, oh, we cored one once. It's 200 years old. And I said, okay, you in 5 years, you better get me a 400-year-old tree, or I'm coming back and I'm going to find it for you. Because like these, they're underestimating this tree because they think it's just a birch. And so they're not coring it because it doesn't live a long time. But that's what we used to think about tulip poplar, or that's what we used to think about so many species. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up a little bit now. We're going to come back to the Harvard forest, and we're going to talk about individual trees, but also the chorus of how we find out information about the environment, something like that. This is all new. So this is the Harvard forest. This is the Slab City tract where some of the nice shagbark hickories live. The great thing about working at the Harvard forest is we know a lot about the Harvard forest. We have stone walls, so we can figure out land use histories, but we know when things happen, and we have an archive that has notes and everything written down, you know, so much written down for 100 years and beyond. This past summer, this is Alicia Andrews. She's a teacher of science at Quabbin District. She was a research experience for teachers, and she came in and she created a data nugget, which is a way of taking real data, turning it into a lesson for middle schoolers so they can learn about science using real data that we collect. Really nice. And it's all online. You can find it. It's fabulous, and she just did such a great job. Towards the end of her summer, she said, you know, I want to go core some trees so I can have model cores to teach from. I said, oh, that's a great idea. I need some of those too. So she and I went out to Slab City to core the red oaks. Red oaks have really easy rings to see, so they're a good species to teach on. You don't want to start with maples at all. And I wanted to go to Slab City because there are red oaks that look like this. And this smoothing bark sometimes says, hey, I could be pretty old. But in the back of my mind, I said, oh, this is not going to be very interesting because these trees are 130 years old. And that's old, but it's not old. I'm a snob when it comes to tree age, and but I said, let's go core them. They're going to be great for teaching, and turns out they taught me a lot about science too. This is again a spaghetti plot of about 15, 16 red oaks that we cored at the Harvard forest. The orange is the mean line, and you can see there's a lot of things happening here. And that's the suppressed red oak that's like this big and 130 years old. Okay. So now let's talk about individual lives and individuality. These are 4 trees from within that population that I wanted to pull out and talk about because there are interesting stories in each of them. We're not going to go through them too detailed because you've been very patient enough. But I want to draw your attention to one thing here. There's that suppressed red oak growing with very wide rings in the 1940s, probably was released by the 1938 hurricane. Here's the orange tree growing extremely slow, but look, by today it's caught up with the trees that are catching up. So who's going to win if you're looking at a forest right now? Who's going to win in 80 years? All of them that live. You can't really predict. Maybe you can. There are some great foresters that can make these predictions, but looking at this, I don't think you could have predicted that the orange tree is going to be doing just as fine as the other ones. But let's talk about some events here and what we see in these rings. This first dashed line, this is the 1938 hurricane, and you can see as soon as it hit, the ring widths for the 3 surviving trees went down immediately. And in fact, I'll show you this ring, but the late wood the late wood, the summer wood of this tree is very, very narrow. And I'm interpreting this, that the trees all got damaged by the hurricane. It might have been a dry year that year too, but I don't think it was. I think 1939 is damage from the hurricane, suppressing growth for a year. And then the green tree right here explodes in growth. So maybe its neighbor fell over and it got released from competition. The second vertical line is the 1953 tornado that hit, that we learned about after we cored these trees. And you can see the black and the green tree are released. They increase in growth suddenly. We learned that there was a salvage cut in this stand right after the tornado. So the trees are picking this up. Not all the trees, but some of the trees. And so within a population, you get a chorus of what's happening in the forest. Each individual tree has its own part to sing. That's good. I just made that up. Here's 1981. This is the gypsy moth defoliation event. Really defoliated the forest. It looked like winter, so they say. And you can see all the trees were really crushed, defoliated by that. And you know, the green tree doesn't. It sort of recovers. The blue tree sort of recovers, but they don't kind of grow in the same way. But that orange tree keeps on trucking, right? So there's individual stories here. Within this. And yeah, so let me just show you the rings now. So this is, I was telling this story before we had the ring width data because I could see this and I have the just the experience of looking at all this. Here's the 1938. Here's the late wood of 1939 where they're all narrow, and I'm interpreting this maybe probably as canopy damage and reduced growth. I didn't tell you about what happened here, but there was a gypsy moth defoliation event in the mid-40s. This individual tree shuts down. There's no late wood hardly for 5 years here, 6 years here. And then here's 1, 2, 3, 4. 53 is the tornado. 54 was a frost event, and this showed up in the hickories. And here's the salvaging log, and the tree's released. 3 serious events in this tree, and then when it gets released from competition in the mid-50s, it's growing just fine. This tree has a completely different life. Here's 1938, there's 1950, there are 12 rings there. And now there's 2019. It was released with the salvage logging and it's growing like gangbusters. It looks like it maybe almost died in the 40s. And then it was released and it survived. And so you can't really always, people are looking for tipping points to try to predict when the ecosystem is going to change. And I'll tell you, the trees will say, you can't predict this stuff. All right? And I just want to show you this last ring, because these are some of the most gorgeous red oak rings that they're just beautiful. They're really distinct. The late woods are very clear. It was well sanded. And it just shows you the late wood of 39. Here's the gypsy moth defoliation. Virtually no late wood formed in 45, 46. Here's the here's the tornado. Here's the frost event. And then whatever reason, this tree does not grow for 10 years, so maybe it was severely damaged by the tornado. And then in about 62, 63, it takes off. Different lives, individuals, just like all of us are unique. Individual trees have their own unique lives to live. Neighboring trees have similar patterns sometimes, but there are differences. And so, I think you believe now that trees don't read textbooks. Age doesn't matter. Elderly trees can dunk. Who's old? I'm old, much older than you think, and I'm not just projecting, but I'm also telling you that we don't know how long common trees live, especially if they have broad leaves and if they're diffuse spore species. We have no clue. We really, I was at an international meeting a few years ago, and I said, hey, we should core diffuse spore species, and then someone said, they're scary, and I said, no, they're not, dude, just change your eyes. They're fine. It's work, but it's fine. Shade tolerance is a meaningful thing, generally at the population level, but individuals blow this idea out of the water. One of the first longleaf pine, when I was learning to cross-date, longleaf pine is shade intolerant. There was one that was suppressed for 100 years, and then it was released, and it grew 700% in the next 15 years, over the prior 15 years. That's not a shade intolerant tree. That's a tree that wants to live. So with that, I appreciate all your attention. I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I've seen lots of old, big black birches and yellow birches, but I haven't seen old, big white birches or gray birches. Do you know about them yet?
That's a great question, thank you.
Can you repeat?
Oh, yeah. He said he's seen a lot of big old gray black birches, but he's never seen big old gray or paper birches. And I don't know much about gray birch, to be honest. And we cored actually paper birch this summer. Daniel's partner that summer, Sophie, lab partner, she had some experience. I said, oh, just work with the birches. You have experience, you can do that. They're easy. And paper birch just grows fast and doesn't live too long, and it'll be easy. No, it was not easy. I almost quit, she almost quit. It was really, really difficult. And so they weren't very old because the landscape of the Harvard forest is not very old. And we haven't looked hard. But paper birch produced these false rings. And so I told you about micro rings, and I told you about missing rings, but there's the opposite, this false ring, where a tree grows a ring in a certain year, and then some event happens. Usually it's a drought in the middle of the season, and it kind of starts to shut down like it's the end of the growing season. And when it starts raining again, it takes off again like it's the beginning of the growing season. So everything I told you about trees growing in a year, then there's dynamics within the dynamics. It's really incredible what trees can do. Paper birch does this stuff that it looks like there's 3 rings, and it's not. It's 1 ring. And so I'm not going to predict anything, hardly any more about trees. I think in Canada, I think they've gotten some paper birch that are over 200 years old. You know, the stands in the Adirondacks that came up with the fires in the early 1900s, there are birch that are still alive there. They're 120, 130 years old. One of my colleagues said, why are you going to study paper birch? Because it's just going to grow fast and die young. And I'm like, are you sure? Because I'm not sure, and we haven't been able to prove anything like that here, but paper birch is beyond the beauty of it. Paper birch now, to me, is way more interesting than I would have said a year ago. It's just that one experience with 15 trees, maybe she cored 30, just changed my idea. There's something happening, and well, it's a tree. It's just a tree, and it can do amazing things. But I don't know much more than that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Are you able to cross-date across species of trees?
You can. We don't typically do that because trees are individuals and species are kind of specific to them. You know, species are specific to themselves. But the first time we worked with old growth yellow birch, the cross dating was really, you think I'm kidding, but I'm going to tell you, almost 2 technicians almost quit on me because of this species. You might say, oh, you're making things up. And I'm like, no, they were really frustrated. It's really difficult to work with. They were kind of perfectionists at it, but they had cross-dated it as best I could. And even when I looked at the data, I said, I think you got it, but I can't tell. And so what we did was we distilled the data to a single time series and made it as pure as we could in terms of individual changes for a year. And we compared it to red oak, and they cross-dated. It wasn't perfect. It was very weak. Statistically, we would say it failed, you know, if you care about 0.05 and all that, a scientific level of cutoff. But it cross-dated, and it confirmed our dating. And so tulip poplar and chestnut oak and white oak cross-date really nicely. Ed Cook did a study of 12 species down in East Texas in the early 2000s. And it's not about cross-dating, but he's learned that the climate response of white oaks are different than red oaks. And I think it's white oaks are more similar to beech in terms of their cross-dating, their climate response, than red oaks. So there's a division even within the oaks where they will cross-date, they have a similar climate response, but they're actually quite different. And we see this a lot. So you can between species, and yeah, you can. And oaks are more similar to each other, and pines are generally more similar to each other. I would say, though, that 5-needled pines are very different than the other pines. And they have just a different physiology, and it's expressed differently in how they grow. Like white pine is weird and plastic and interesting. and pitch pine and longleaf pine are a little more straightforward in terms of cross dating. Yes?
Getting back to the 500-year-old tulip tree,
Yeah.
how do you determine the age of the hollow tree?
You don't. Well, you don't. You shouldn't. People do it. They do it all the time, and I think in some situations you can make estimates, and that's okay, but I don't think in our forest I don't think you should, because the way, the question was, how do you estimate the age of an old tree? So when I tell you that was a 500-year-old tree, those are the rings that I saw. So how do I know that it might be 600 or 700 years? Is what some people do is they take the inner 20 or 30 rings and they get the average growth rate, and then they figure out how much wood they might be missing to the center, and then they just multiply it. And on the lava field in Mongolia, that might work. In the Doug fir in the Colorado Plateau, where it's a very simple ecosystem, that might work. But in our ecosystem, where a tree could be suppressed, as I showed you, for 100, 150 years, or could come up in a gap and be 30 years and this big instead of 100 years this big, you're just adding noise, and I'd rather not do that. So, but people do it. The oldest white pine in New York State was said to be a certain age, and then they said it was a extrapolated age. So I don't do it anymore, and because you're just making things up.
So you counted 500 rings then?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It was 509 rings, and then nothing.
And then some.
So it was absolutely 509 rings. Absolutely. And we've found trees that are 400, tulips that are 450 and 470. I think 470, something like that, but 450, 420. Not a lot of them, but enough that it's not uncommon. Yes, sir.
So you asked, there's a question about cross dating.
Yeah.
It sounds like just picking two trees, two different species next to each other would be tough, but if you've collected data from a standard one species and data from another species, and you analyze them separately and then put together the dates, could you form any new patterns that you could say kind of offset the misconceptions that birches do grow fast, or
That wasn't where I anticipated you were going.
Okay.
So.
do you want me to restate it?
I want to think about it more.
Okay, so basically, you said when you opened, you're very interested initially broadly in trees, and now you're really focused on individuals. Now that you're there, can we go out from there a little bit further? So if you're working with red oaks, cross dating, they kind of have similar growth patterns.
Yeah.
In that same stand, can you grab white oaks or something nearby and just kind of overlay those and see if you can find any trends and differences in responses? Is that the same as cross dating, or is that?
Yeah. So the question was, can you take trees, and eventually you said same species within the same stand and learn something new that way, and it does come back to that cross dating thing. I kept it on cross dating and climate response, but you can see different growth trends and growth trajectories between these species, and you can learn something new that way. The first part of your question, when you initially asked it, you were thinking at much larger scales, and that's a really interesting question too, and that's where I thought you were going. I was like, oh yeah, I can. And so at those larger scales, you can get trees that cross-date with each other that are 100 miles or more away from each other. The pattern is there at the annual time step, and so So we're still just learning about white pine, for example, and someone collected some white pine from dead logs in Pisgah State Forest. We don't have any white pine collections nearby to cross-date that. Well, we do now, but at the time we didn't. So we were trying to use white pine from New York State and Maine to cross-date these logs in New Hampshire, and it didn't work. And that's because of a little bit of what white pine is a funny tree, and so we're going to blame it on the 5 needles again, because this is what I've heard a lot. But I could take oak at almost that same scale, and they would agree with each other pretty well. But that's just like year-to-year changes, which is how we cross-date. And the longer trends at decadal and centennial scales, there are some similar patterns at larger scales, but then there can be very different patterns at the smaller scales, like what we just showed at the end of this too. So does that help? Is that
Yeah.
good? Good. Thank you. Yeah.
One has a general impression, maybe from reading the popular literature, that the oldest trees are in the most stressful environments,
Mhm.
like the bristlecone.
Yeah.
Or the white cedar in Ontario.
Yeah.
Is that something you see, or is that just more noise?
No. I think that is, since I came to the Harvard Forest, so the question is, oh yeah, do trees in more stressed environments seem to live longer? That's your basic question.
Well, obviously many trees in stressful environments.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is the soft living in the forest, you die younger than the hard living on the rocks.
Yeah, so, if you have an easier life as a tree, do you not live quite as long? And so, this comes back to one of the main principles. I won't call it a theory. Since I went from dendroclimate and earth science to Harvard Forest and ecology, I was been pushed to think more about theory. We don't have many theories in dendrochronology, honestly, but this might be one of them. So it's an idea that we've known for a long time, it's been documented at least since the 50s, that the oldest individuals primarily live in the most stressed conditions, like the bristlecone pine. The oldest white spruce lives right at tree line, and it can live well over 500 years. But if you get into a normal forest, white spruce can maybe live 350 or 400. And so we have seen now that live fast, die young seems to be a pretty good principle for trees too. The oldest trees often grew very slow when they were young, and then they just persisted, and now they're the oldest trees in the landscape. The youngest trees in the landscape today generally grew a little bit faster. Not all of them, but as a rule of thumb, we've done some analyses this way. So that is a general tendency that you can really count on. Now, when you bring it back to our forests here, our closed canopy forests, I would argue that the trees that are sitting in the understory for 80 or 100 years are stressed. Not in the same way that bristlecone pine is, but they're stressed and slow growing. And so the lack of shade and the lack of sun and high competition produces a different kind of stress, and those trees can turn into some of the oldest individuals. And so often when someone comes up to me, and you can if you want after this, but I'm going to tell you right now, often people come up to me and say, I know this old tree, and I go, maybe. Quite often the oldest trees are only this big, that we have found that we can document well. That big tulip poplar was not as old as the small tulip poplar that I showed you. It was faster growing. I've been tricked a few times. I've cored some big trees that actually were quite old. But the general tendency is big trees are younger, and they're bigger because they have a bigger canopy, they have a bigger root system. If the above ground biomass is equal to below ground biomass, which is generally what we think, they're taking up lots of water, nutrients, gathering sun, and they're just growing fast. And so generally, not always, big trees are younger than forest-grown trees that are medium size. And so there are traits, and I didn't talk anything about this today, but I have a paper you can see, it's written for everyone, because even my colleagues didn't know what old trees look like. And they're not big. They can be, but they're usually not. Yes, sir.
So on the individual level, we see some of the older trees starting to capture a lot of carbon. We get bigger growth rings. We showed examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
Since those diameters are at the far edge of the tree, it'd be capturing considerably more carbon than if that ring was in the middle. And then if we expand that thought, is it possible at the stand level, I haven't been following the literature on this, but that a little older stand could be capturing quite a bit more carbon. You hear a lot of chatter, including in the agency I work in, Mass Wildlife, that younger forests are capturing lots of carbon, more carbon than the old trees.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. So when I found this during my dissertation, and I was going around showing it, it was kind of a big deal, like we didn't expect this. And those are just individual trees, and you really can't scale individual trees up to the stand level, like you're saying. So the question is, can we take this idea that old trees are taking up lots of carbon, that maybe old forests are taking up a lot of carbon? Soon after that, people started studying old growth forests. And let me back up for a quick second. There's an idea that forests are over mature. Let's kill that word, please. Please. It was in the IPCC just 15 years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They said old growth forests were over mature and not taking up carbon. They might be carbon positive, like releasing more carbon than they were taking up. Thankfully, people started looking at this in the 2000s and said, well, they actually might be taking up carbon. So the growth rate maybe of younger forests might be higher at the stand level, but I would argue that at the stand level, old growth forests are taking up carbon, taking up lots of carbon, and they're storing lots of carbon because it's in the soil and it's in the logs, and those are slowly released back to the atmosphere. When you cut and open that up, it decays. So we should keep trees as they are and leave forests as they are. So I don't like that argument. I haven't kept up with it enough, to be honest, because I've been thinking about different things, but it's foolhardy to me now to cut a forest to save carbon. You know what I'm saying? Because like it would take another 80 years to get back to maybe where it was. But I've been to forestry meetings where people are saying U.S. Forest Service land is middle-aged, it's got dead bods, they're 40 to 80 years old. And I went, no. But there's those attitudes that 40 to 80-year-old trees are old, and we got to get them in shape. And that's just, it's crazy, right? I mean, it's just not based on science. Yes, ma'am?
Are there any categories of early life stressors in trees that predict longevity, like with humans? I'm a developmental psychologist.
Yeah. No, that's great.
That I'm making, but I'm just wondering if there's certain kind of stressors that lead to resilience, and certain kind, I imagine there are, that lead in the other direction. Do you guys categorize that?
So the question is, sometimes you can predict longevity in people based on...
Calorie restriction is associated with longevity, but many other stressors are in fact not. But that kind of stressor is.
Yeah, so calorie restriction tends to, in the biological world, lead to longevity. And this is where I'm going to say, this is where trees are different than people in some ways, but because what trees do is they produce new hearts every year, right? They produce new cells every year. The living part of the tree are the leaves, the roots, and this much of the outside of the tree. And that's regenerated new every year. Wouldn't it be great if we could renew our hearts every year? So this is where we're very different from trees. But your calorie restriction, and I thank you for saying that, because I was like, I don't know at all. That's a really good question. But calorie restriction, when I think about what we were talking about in terms of suppression in these forests, to me, I used to teach, when I teach, I would bring the trees in and I'd say, this is a calorie restriction. You're restricted from the sun by being shaded. You have a smaller root system. You're restricted from water and nutrients. And so it's not a calorie, it's a calorie restriction in some ways. It's a very similar principle, I'd say. And those trees that are just really suppressed and stressed in the understory, they're not getting a lot of sun, tend to live longer. Now, there is a plant ecophysiologist who has connected growth rates to longevity. And he said that, size to longevity. And when trees get bigger, they tend not to live long.
Taller humans.
And yeah.
No.
And taller trees, because if you're a tall tree, you're going to catch lightning, snow, ice, wind. But if you're down here, you're kind of sheltered a little bit. And so he has connected that size mediates longevity. And so the big trees, he argues, it's harder for them to maintain that system. Even though they're renewing every year, it's harder to maintain that system And his work tends to say that it might shorten the longevity of the individual tree. So it's a very similar concept. I don't know if anyone's pursued it enough. I've thought about it, but I don't know. That's a very good question. And thanks for Kelly Restriction. That helped me a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.